Well, everybody, good morning. Welcome to another West Coast User Group meeting. This will be our last meeting for the year, so thank you so much for attending today. Just a quick overview of what to expect for today. I'm just going to name some organizations that have signed up for the meeting. After that, we will watch a client demo led by Logan Travis from the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. And then hopefully after that, we can generate some Q&A and a group discussion about fiscally sponsored organizations. And then we'll end the meeting with a few reminders on our end. So for participating organizations for this meeting, we have the Annenberg Foundation, California Arts Council, California Endowment, Citibank, Hirsch and Associates, the Margaret Casey Foundation, the Pacific Foundation Services, Silicon Valley Community Foundation, the State Bar of California, Sunlight Giving, the Washington Traffic Safety Commission, the Vancouver Foundation. Okay, so I'm gonna get some reminders right off the bat. Next week we have the second workflows webinar happening on December 4th and December 6th. After that, the week after we will have the versioning webinar. It will be on December 11th and December 13th. I think these are pretty popular topics for the community. If you'd like to be part of the webinar, always register at smartsimple.com/events. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter for this meeting. So we have Logan Travis presenting, and I just wanted to see, Logan, can you speak up for a bit, just to make sure everybody hears you?
Yes, can everybody hear me okay?
I could hear you. I think everybody could. Can people raise their hands if they heard Logan?
Yeah, it looks like we've got a few people in the chat room.
Oh, perfect. Okay. All right, thank you. So just a quick intro. Logan joined the Silicon Valley Community Foundation in 2014 as an enterprise application support specialist. He helps with development, implementation, and the support of SVCF's information systems and business applications. He also brings his experience as a senior educational consultant for Blackbaud. He trained users to improve their effectiveness with Blackbaud's Edge software suite. He also led new application implementations, database optimizations, and business practice improvements. So without further ado, I am going to pass the mic to Logan.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to do this demo. I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen and hopefully make sure that will work.
Perfect. Thank you, Logan.
Let's see here. Okay, would everybody give me a quick raised hand or in the chat just confirming that you see my screen? I've got the Zoom launch window open. Okay, great. So it looks like we're good to get started. So I was asked to do a demo for something unique in our version of Smart Simple. And it came to mind that I have actually worked with a few other people through this user group who had questions on how we have facilitated fiscally sponsored organizations wanting to apply for our competitive grants. And so I thought that would make a pretty good topic since it utilizes a lot of maybe less frequently used Smart Simple functionality. There is maybe one problem. It is a fairly detailed discussion, and I realize my 15 minutes is maybe a little short. So what I think I'll do is quickly go through this slide deck that I put together. It has a few screen grabs and again, kind of a description of how we have dealt with fiscal sponsors. And then if I finish before the 15-minute mark, I'll hop into our Smart Simple instance and show some of the more detailed sections. If I end up taking the full 15 minutes, then we'll see how the discussion section of this group goes. And I'm happy to show parts of our Smart Simple instance for those that have questions.
Logan, just an FYI, we don't have to be limited to 15 minutes. If we go a little over that, 20 minutes, it's fine, as long as we get a good discussion going and you present the system clearly to everyone in the meeting.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, I'll go ahead and get started. What I want to talk about really are some of the unique problems that fiscal sponsorship relationships present when dealing with competitive grants in Smart Simple. I should preface this with I have a tech background. I am not a grants officer. We had a really wonderful grants officer work with us, work with me especially, to figure out how we wanted to deal with fiscal sponsors in our system. But caution, if you have questions about how actual fiscal sponsorship work in the real world, I'm probably not the best one to ask. I can, however, get them working in Smart Simple. And to talk about some of the, again, unique requirements they present, I've listed a few. So one of the first ones is that the fiscal sponsorship is a relationship between two organizations, which in terms of Smart Simple functionality, while it can handle it, it again sort of presents some questions about how you want to handle it. Like, do you want to allow multiple fiscal sponsors to one organization? Do you want to track history? And so we went through those questions, and again, I'll kind of go through each of these requirements and show you our answers to them. Another is that you need to vet the fiscal sponsor relationship as well as the fiscally sponsoring organization. And we use a universal tracking application for that we call our entity vetting manager. You also need to distinguish between the fiscal sponsor, which I'm probably going to start referring to as the applicant, and the fiscally sponsored organization, which I'll probably start referring to as the applicant, and the fiscal sponsor, which we generally refer to as payee in our terminology, on your submissions. And this is actually where, again, there was an individual part of this user group that asked for some background that he was struggling with, how to allow the fiscally sponsored organization to create their own submissions and edit those submissions, but also have the fiscal sponsor have a degree of oversight on those submissions. Again, we found a way to use functionality in Smart Simple to accomplish that, which I'll go to in a little bit. And I guess I kind of covered the oversight piece. The last one is that fiscal sponsorship relationships can change. For those of you that have multi-payment grants that you're performing, starting out with a fiscal sponsor relationship that you vetted at the beginning doesn't guarantee that it's going to be the same fiscal sponsor relationship when you get to that second payment or fourth payment or what have you. And again, we found functionality in Smart Simple that helps us accommodate both potentially changes in the fiscal sponsor relationship or even that fiscally sponsored org gaining its nonprofit status. Okay, if you have questions, by the way, please feel free to either raise your hand or type them into the chat. But I'm going to go through each one of these and kind of show you again some quick screen grabs of how we've accomplished this. So talking about the organization to organization relationship, we really do this with two components. The first is that we allow our fiscally sponsored organizations to search for and essentially request, that's the term we like to use, their fiscal sponsor as part of their registration. So I've got a few screen grabs here in the bottom left showing our registration sort of selection page. We have a dedicated page for fiscally sponsored orgs, and then they do have the same IRS search that they would use if they were their own nonprofit. Oh, I do have a question in the chat, and actually this is maybe not a question so much for me, but the question is, okay, go ahead.
If it's being recorded, yes, Charles, it will be recorded. Okay. I will send it, I will send this, the recording to the rest of the group after.
Awesome. Thank you. So again, this is just a standard sign-up page, nothing terribly unique about it. What we do though is instead of using the IRS search to actually fill in standard fields like you would if you were creating a new organization from that search, we use it instead to populate custom fields that we decided to add to our organization profiles. And just again, kind of a quick comment, we chose this because we wanted to make sure that there was only ever one active fiscal sponsor relationship on an organization. There are other ways to accomplish this using actually the organization to organization relationship functions, but that would have potentially allowed for multiple at the same time. Oh, and Rich asks if you're seeing two black boxes. Okay, that's my fault. I have both the user list and the chat windows open. Let me try to move those to safe parts of the screen. I kind of need to see them, so if you have questions, I can deal with them. Rich, let me know if that's...
If you want, Logan, I can relay the questions to you.
Okay, that's better. I'll just go ahead and close them then.
Yeah.
Okay, so recapping, again, we allow for our fiscally sponsored organizations to search for their fiscal sponsor. We do treat that as a request, and we're storing both the name of the fiscal sponsor as well as the tax ID to custom fields on our organization profiles. Now, those requests don't really do very much by themselves. We're really just storing the information, and we even provide a little kind of bubble for our organization contacts to let them know that SVCF still needs to confirm that relationship, but it gives us a starting point and a way to know when we're dealing with the submissions, which we'll see a little bit later on, that we have these additional vetting requirements that we're going to have to handle. And I think I'll pause as I finish kind of each of these slides to see if we have any quick questions. See how well I can do that.
Good so far, Logan.
Okay, great. So speaking of vetting, we do need to vet both the fiscal sponsor as a nonprofit, which I suspect many of you have your own methods for doing, but also this fiscally sponsored relationship. And we want to make sure that we're hopefully tracking both of those elements and making sure that they're recorded correctly. I'm not going to go into too much detail about our universal tracking application that we call the entity vetting manager. We honestly may have overbuilt this a little bit. I've got this weird side-by-side view that the grants officer at the time wanted and all kinds of steps that they go through. But I want to emphasize that what we decided to do was when we finish vetting the fiscally sponsored org, so essentially we're vetting the relationship to the fiscal sponsor, and that entity vetting activity completes, there's a workflow that we run that updates the information back on that organization record. Does a couple of things. One, we have just a very simple custom field that instead flips that red bubble that I showed before to this little blue bubble that says that we have confirmed the fiscal sponsor relationship. But more importantly, there's a third custom field that unfortunately I couldn't quite get onto the screen grab, which stores the system ID for the organization. So on our fiscal, oh, go ahead.
I just have a quick question over here before we go further. Someone is asking, what do you mean when you said requested? Is it the foundation requesting Smart Simple to enable, or an organization requesting the foundation to enable?
So by request, what we mean is that the fiscally sponsored organization has essentially requested SVCF to vet their fiscal sponsor relationship. They're telling us, hey, we've got this fiscal sponsor. We want you to look at it and confirm that it meets, your requirements for a fiscal sponsor. That's what I mean by request.
Perfect. Thank you for answering that, Logan.
You're welcome. So again, after our entity vetting activity completes, we're using a workflow, updating those custom fields that we originally got from the fiscally sponsored organization. That way, if the name is slightly different for the fiscal sponsor or we find a different fiscal sponsor, that's pretty rare. We do end up with the correct information on the fiscally sponsored organization's record. And as I've kind of hinted, but unfortunately couldn't quite get on the slides, we also store the system ID. So we have a sort of an unofficial organization to organization link between the two. And I think I'll pause and see, did we pick up any new questions? Okay.
Good for now, Logan.
All right. Let's talk about the submission then, because this is really where things get actually kind of interesting, because we're using some Smart Simple functionality that I'm not sure very many other users have in place. So to kind of restate the problem, we wanted to allow our fiscally sponsored organizations to manage their own submissions. So we wanted them to apply to our competitive grants. We didn't want them to have to go through their fiscal sponsor or anything complicated like that. So back at the beginning, again, we allowed our fiscally sponsored organizations to register. Those fiscally sponsored organizations create their own submissions. That goes through our own internal approval process. And once they reach a certain step, so I should preface that we don't do this for every single submission. We have 2 or 3 approval steps that they have to get through first. But once they reach a certain step, if we are going to continue moving forward, The functionality that we use on the submission to identify that fiscal sponsor is the organization's standard field. So this is a picture of a submission, navigation bar on the left-hand side. You can link multiple organizations, plural, to a single submission. That is separate from the primary organization that most of you have probably seen on the main tab of a submission. And this is what's going to allow us to not only identify that fiscal sponsor as a payee, but also to add new fiscal sponsors if the relationship changes. Questions so far?
I think we're good for now, Logan.
All right. The other screen grab I have for our submissions is a little section that our grants team wanted, the team that does our vetting. This is something I can demo live because I realize now the screen grab doesn't do it a lot of justice. But if we have a fiscal sponsor, again, we like to call that the payee, and a fiscally sponsored org, which we like to call the applicant, on a submission, then I've created this little side-by-side view for our grants team to make it very, very clear. They actually wouldn't see two of these if it's just a standard competitive grant with just a regular nonprofit. This only shows up if we have a fiscal sponsor, fiscal sponsored organization relationship. All right, last piece, I mentioned that these fiscal sponsor relationships can change. The way we handle that is, one, using that organizations list that I showed before, which is on the submission. If we learn about a new fiscal sponsor relationship, then we go through our vetting process and we add that new fiscal sponsor back to the submission. But the trick here is that we have generally multi-payment grants for a lot of these competitive grants. So if I have my first payment that went out to, say, SVCF is the fiscal sponsor, but now an organization has switched their fiscal sponsor to some other nonprofit, what we do is, again, add the organization to the submission, but then use a report property to pull the most recently associated payee, again, fiscal sponsor, into our invoices.
Logan, I have a question over here. What do you do in the vetting?
Oh, so this is where I'll have to admit, as more the tech side of things, I can't answer all those questions. I can give you a general rundown. So for the fiscal sponsor, our vettings are pretty much just searching IRS. There are some exceptions to that where we might have to reach out and double check something. Sorry, IRS and OFAC. Don't want to forget that step. So for nonprofits, it's really just making sure that every year we're double checking that they still have their nonprofit status. For the fiscally sponsored organizations, it's basically gathering documents. I don't unfortunately know what the documents are. Sorry, tech guy. But gathering documents that prove they have that fiscal sponsor relationship. That's the entity vetting for the fiscally sponsored org.
All right. Thank you, Logan.
Okay. All right, and again, this is my last sort of problem statement. So recapping, if I have an invoice that was paid, say, when the grant was originally approved, that's going to lock in the fiscal sponsor at that time. It becomes a historic and static record. But any unpaid invoices will always read the most recently associated organization to the submission. So if the fiscal sponsor relationship changes, that next invoice that we need to pay will reflect that next fiscal sponsor. All right, that's all I have for now. I think my timing was about right. And I realize these are all static images, so if we want to take a look at our version of Smart Simple, I'm happy to do that. But what questions do we have?
I think you can keep going with the live demo, Logan.
Okay, I'm gonna probably show really the two sections then that I think are a bit unique. Oh, do you have a question?
Hold on. Did you use the parent organization feature? Yeah,
so we unfortunately got a little too far into our implementation before we realized we could have done that. The way ours is structured right now, we really only have SVCF as kind of a root organization, and then some generic organizations that act as parents, and they're really more of a grouping mechanism for us. But yes, the parent organization would have been another way to do it. We were just too far down the road when we realized that.
Okay.
Let's see.
There's another one over here. Did you have to use the organization function and not the relationship function? Could you please explain more? Also, the parent org is a sub-entity function. Is that a better option?
Yeah, so I'm not, well, I guess I could give you some background on why we chose the custom field as opposed to any of the built-in functionality, and that might help you decide. And I think for this, let me go ahead and switch over to something a little bit more interesting screen-wise. So there were a couple of additional functions that we wanted to have when dealing with fiscal sponsors that essentially led us to these custom fields. The first one was we really wanted to make sure that we only ever had one active fiscal sponsor. And so if you use the relationship functions in Smart Simple, they're inherently designed to allow for multiple relationships. And while we could have put some procedures in place or even maybe a little bit of validation, it would have been possible to list multiple fiscal sponsors for one organization, and we wanted to avoid that. So that was a big reason to use the custom fields. The other, which I realize I may not be able to show because I got too far in my demo. Okay, no, it's here. We ultimately turned this off for end users, so I will preface it with that. But there was a request when we started our implementation to allow the fiscally sponsored organization to make their own request for a change in fiscal sponsor. And we wanted to do that originally in Smart Simple. So this lovely little button that I have hanging out down here, this is no longer available to external users. We realized fairly quickly, maybe like 6 months in, that allowing these requests to come in through Smart Simple, it didn't work for us. We really needed them to come in through our own staff, and so we've started directing users to use email. But the original functionality, which we were able to accomplish with custom fields that we couldn't really get working any other way, was this allowed me to search for and find a change in fiscal sponsor. I don't know. Let's say this one. And it would update the custom fields on the organization record. And in fact, if we still had this available, pretending that I was the organization contact, I could save that change. And it would sort of indirectly, let me scroll here. Well, it should have saved that change, but again, I've turned this off for everybody. So it would have normally saved the change if we had left it on and actually indirectly prompted us to do another entity vetting of that fiscal sponsor relationship. So again, the other methods you mentioned would work. It's going to be kind of a question for yourself of any other constraints that you want to place on how you're handling fiscal sponsor relationships. And the constraints we placed led us towards custom fields.
Okay. Next question. Can we assume that all fiscal sponsors are registered in the system?
That is an excellent question because it highlights one of the weaknesses for our choice to allow fiscally sponsored organizations to register. And the immediate answer to that is no, not all fiscal sponsors are registered in our system. We do have quite a large number of organizations, of nonprofits, that could potentially be fiscal sponsors that are registered in our system. So it's not a huge issue, but it has occurred where a fiscally sponsored organization, instead of using our fiscal sponsor registration form, uses the regular nonprofit registration form. And if we don't have their fiscal sponsor in our system, at least initially, the fiscally sponsored organization looks like it's the fiscal sponsor. Since we launched Smart Simple in 2017, that has only happened 4 times that I know of. So it hasn't been too bad, but that is a good point. If you start with a much smaller organization database, then the method allowing a fiscally sponsored org to register has that risk.
Okay. Another question, what if they switch fiscal sponsors?
So yeah, we previously allowed the fiscally sponsored organizations to use this search function to change their organization profile. That's where we're storing this. We no longer do that. So essentially, when we do have changes these days, it goes through our community impact team. They've got a kind of a generic email address where they'll accept those requests. And then if it's relevant, it's like sometimes the changes aren't relevant for us because we don't have an active submission with that fiscally sponsored org anymore. But if it's relevant, they'll route it to our grants team and we'll go through another vetting process that would update that organization profile instead.
Okay, another one over here. Not sure if I might have missed it, but how did a fiscal sponsor arrive at the registration form and are able to search for their fiscal sponsor via EIN? Currently, the registration form only allows nonprofits to put in their organization.
Yeah, let me go ahead and show our registration process. So this is our general landing page, just a normal login. And if we have grant seekers registering, we use the, I'm going to get this terminology wrong. This is built-in functionality of Smart Simple to create these different shortcuts. I apologize, I can't remember the name, but you'll see it as an option when you're creating sign-up pages. And for our fiscal sponsors, we request that they type their organization name in, because as I think you kind of highlighted, there's no suitable source for them to search if they're a fiscally sponsored org. But they would use the IRS search to find their fiscal sponsor. So if I wanted to say find Silicon Valley. And this is what would populate back to those custom fields on the organization profile. Okay.
All right.
Okay. Other questions?
None so far right now. I think we can move on with the demo of the live system.
Okay. What I want to then show, I think, is kind of the most important piece, because a lot of these questions have been about changes to fiscal sponsor relationships. I want to show how our submissions and the payment process handles that change. So I'm going to open a test submission that I created, one that I originally associated with Silicon Valley Community Foundation as the payee.
1 second, Logan. Before we go further, another question is: if that fiscal sponsor is in your system already, will it show as a duplicate?
Okay, maybe I'll answer what might be two questions here. If the fiscally sponsored organization is in our system and the names match, then yes, it'll get flagged as a duplicate, and we have a process that would allow an additional contact on an organization to eventually get access to an existing organization. Emphasis there on the names have to match, since unfortunately we don't have anything to search against other than name. We get a few duplicates now and again for fiscally sponsored organizations because of that. If the fiscal sponsor exists, it really doesn't matter. Actually, it can exist or not exist in our system, because when we take in a fiscally sponsored org, all we're doing is storing custom fields on that fiscally sponsored organization record to start. It's up to our own grants team to actually get around to the fiscal sponsor organization record and determine what they need to do. They might need to create a new one. They might already have it and just need to go through vetting. But at least at the point of registration, we're not making really any changes, regardless of whether we have the fiscal sponsor or don't.
Okay, I think that answers it, Logan. Thank you.
Cool. All right, let me hop into that test submission then. Hopefully I got this far enough along. And I probably should close some of these boxes so they don't eat up your screen. So as I kind of mentioned, this test submission was originally associated with Silicon Valley Community Foundation as what we like to call the payee. So this is the fiscal sponsor of my test organization. We've already gone through the vetting. We've already added this payee relationship to the submission. On my invoices for payment, we'll therefore see Silicon Valley Community Foundation as the payee. So this lovely little name right here. But let's say, this is my second payment for this submission and the fiscal sponsor relationship has changed. Again, we would go through our vetting process again. We'd get that email notification that it's changed in all of those steps. But ultimately, all our team has to do to make that next payment ready for that new fiscal sponsor is back on the submission, under organizations, they just add, oops, not in edit mode here. They just add the new fiscal sponsor as an additional payee organization on the submission. So let me think of one here. Yeah. I will say the interface here can cause a bit of confusion because, as I kind of hinted, it's the most recently added organization relationship that we use for future payments on this submission, but we don't really have a lot of control over the sort order inside of the submission itself. So just kind of have to trust that Smart Simple knows that this one I just added, Logan's test payee, is the most recent fiscal sponsor.
I have a question here, Logan.
Okay.
How do you show the fiscal sponsor and the applicant on the grant agreement?
I'll need to find a grant agreement, and again, documents are not as much my thing. Give me a minute, and I'll have to try to find one that we might have saved. As far as that change to the invoice, though, just kind of finishing this up, with the Logan's test payee being the most recently added organization relationship, all unpaid invoices on this submission have now switched over to that payee. So going forward, this would be essentially the fiscal sponsor that we're sending the money to. And all it took was adding another organization relationship to the submission. All right, so grant agreements. Let's see if I can find one. Activities. Let's find grant agreements. Well, any status should probably be okay. Darn. I'm just being a little hesitant here because I don't necessarily want to show a real grant agreement. Oh, you know what I could do? Let's do this instead. This would not be the appropriate status for creating a grant agreement in our system, but that won't stop me. I'm a system administrator. Grant agreement. I am going to have to cheat a little bit, though, and hop this through some statuses. So bear with me just a moment. Let's see here. Okay, if that all worked appropriately, this should be my grant agreement. Let me make it a little bit bigger here. Let's see if we can find it. So we've got our grantee, reporting requirements. Well, I think I will have to get back to you. It's been a while since I worked on this template, and I'm guessing that our grants team is either manually typing it in or by me hopping through statuses, I broke something. So let me take that question away, and I'll try to answer it back a little later.
Okay, thanks, Logan. Another question that I have here, could we see the coding in the payee field in the invoice activity record?
Yeah, I thought someone would ask. Sure. So I will warn you, I don't know. I have a preference when working with custom fields in Smart Simple. I tend to create a lot of reports and use the report property function pretty frequently. So this will initially not look like very much, but I'll show you the report that we're using as well. So here's my invoice. We can see that it's pulling in my most recently added organization relationship. Let me hop into configuration mode here. And as I kind of warned you, I do like to use these report properties. I come from a database background, so the reports feel almost like working with SQL. Good news is I can just borrow this ID, 40134, and check out my report. So, not too bad. Essentially, what I do is I start from the submission, because that's where the organization is associated. This is a standard Arcadia report, Neo report. It's not the old style report, so you can do this with the new report builder. There's a data set available with UTAs. It's called companies, instead of organizations. You have to do a little translating terminology-wise. And when you add the quote-unquote companies data set to your UTA data sets, you'll automatically get this intersection, which will have things related to that relationship. The key thing here, and this is maybe a little hard to see, is that the link between the two, there we go. So this data set that is essentially the companies, the organizations, every one of those relationships to the submission has its own ID number, separate from the organization ID, separate from the submission ID. And those ID numbers are assigned in order. So if you can imagine, the first organization relationship I ever created to a submission was number 1. The next one was 2 and 3 and 4. And so all I do is I select all of the relationships on the submission, sort them in descending order by this relationship ID, and then I tweak the report using the advanced function to only provide me the top record, essentially giving me the most recently associated relationship to that submission.
Okay, I have another question here, Logan. I may have missed this part, but if you have an organization with multiple fiscal sponsors across various grants, how do you handle this? And in that case, how do you specify who the payee is and the other details?
Yeah, so if we end up with multiple fiscal sponsors, there's some good news and bad news. The good news is the submissions will handle that no problem. Basically, if I have submission 1 where we're using fiscal sponsor A, then on that submission on my organization section, the fiscal sponsor A would be listed as the payee. So kind of hopping back, you can imagine, fiscal sponsor A is the last payee relationship I added to this submission, just this one. And if there's a fiscal sponsor B for a different submission, then that one, fiscal sponsor B, would be listed on that submission's organizations tab. So it works out fine at the submission level. Can have as many fiscal sponsors as you want. Just make sure that each submission has the right one on it. It doesn't work out so great on the fiscally sponsored organization's organization profile, because we really, again, we made this choice when we started to only ever allow one active fiscal sponsor relationship. We do track changes on these fields, so in theory I could maybe look back through the history and find out what it was before. Also, it looks like I might have a glitch on some of these. Ignore that. But we don't ever show on the organization profile for the fiscally sponsored organization multiple fiscal sponsors. That was a design choice we made up front.
Okay, I think those are that's all our questions so far, Logan. Thank you.
I don't really have any other sections I was planning to show live. Are there other requests? If not, I'm happy to hand this back over to you.
Any other questions?
Okay.
I think we've, there's another one over here. Rich from Margaret Casey says this was fantastic. Thank you, Logan.
Very welcome. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing. I'll give, do I have to give this back to you, or can you take control again?
I can take it from here. Hold on 1 second. All right, do you see my screen now? Is it still you?
I do, thanks.
Okay, so again, just reminders, webinars for next month, Workflows Part 2, December 4th, December 6th, versioning December 11th, December 13th. So if that's it for now, I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you so much, everybody. I have another question here. Hold on 1 second. Okay, there's a question here. Is this feature available to all foundation clients of Smart Simple, and only requires reaching out to tech to enable?
So I'll go ahead and take that. The short answer is yes. This is all using regular Smart Simple functionality. It's maybe piecing things together in a mildly unique way. About the only piece that's unusual, I'd say, is if you remember on the organization record, when I showed that search for IRS fiscal sponsor, we do use a little bit of JavaScript to take what the user selects and write it back to the custom fields. But otherwise, the organizations field on the submission, that's a standard function. The report properties I showed, that's standard functionality. And again, you wouldn't have to do JavaScript like we did if you chose some of the other options for creating the organization relationships. That was just how we chose to handle it.
Okay. Thank you, Logan. Anything else before we wrap up again? Okay. Again, thank you for attending. This will be our last meeting for the year. If you have any suggestions, topics, or if you'd like to volunteer to demo your system for our next for the next user group meeting for 2019, please feel free to reach out at any time. And also, oh, you're very welcome, Charles. Also, before I forget, West Coast Elevate is coming to you in 2019. For those who do not know yet, we are doing Elevate 2019 in San Diego. So definitely look forward when registration opens and when we announce our save the dates in January. Again, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Logan. Have a great rest of your day.
You're welcome.